We have a very important panel discussion on Indo-US relations today, prospects and challenges, on behalf of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library and our partners IAFA and the University of Chicago, the International House at the University of Chicago, and other partners. I welcome all our distinguished panelists of the discussion, and I also welcome all the distinguished members of the audience to the panel discussion this evening. We have the pleasure of having Dr. Dennis Jorgens, Director, International House, Chicago University, Ambassador Surendra Kumar, who is the spirit behind this program. Ambassador Kumar, with his indefatigable zeal, has organized many other programs in the past, also in collaboration with him. In collaboration with us, I congratulate him on the organization of this program. We have Ambassador Arun K. Singh, formerly Ambassador to Israel, France and USA. We have Mr. Edgar Kagan, DCM, American Embassy, New Delhi. And we have Professor Arun Kumar, formerly Professor Jawaharlal Nehru University, currently Chairman and Professor ISS, New Delhi. We have Major General retired Ashok K. Mehta, formerly Major General of the Indian Army, Defense and Security Expert. Zorawar Singh, Fellow, Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. Ms. Suhasini Heather, famous journalist, national editor, The Hindu. Professor K.P. Vijay Lakshmi, Professor US Studies, CCU, SLAS, SIS, JNU. I welcome them all on the occasion of this panel discussion. The subject of today's panel discussion is extremely important. India-US relations today are one of the key relations in the international arena. To my mind, India's relations with the US have gone through, broadly speaking, three phases. One was the phase till the independence of India and till the beginning of the Cold War, till about 1945-50 or so. This can be described as an age of idealism, when, driven by its own streak of idealism, America looked upon India as a land of comparative innocence and lent support to India's freedom struggle. Many of India's leaders at the time of freedom struggle were on good relations with the American leaders. And then, of course, the Cold War came, and the Cold War, in a way you can say, tilted America and India both in directions which were not good for India's relations with the US. All that, of course, started changing with the end of the Cold War, with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. But to my mind, it was actually the first NDA regime during the Prime Ministership of Mr. Vajpayee, who described India-US as natural partners, that the relationship actually started turning around. And now I can say confidently that despite minor irritants here and there, the future of India-US relations seems to be very, very bright. Of course, there are prospects and challenges which are going to be discussed by the distinguished panelists today. But I strongly believe that the future of India-US relations is very, very good because of a score of factors, because of the shared values, because of a certain convergence in the national interests of the two countries. So with these few words, now I would like to invite Dr. Dennis Jorgens to give his address.
So good evening and welcome to this evening's special program, a panel discussion on India-US relations today, prospects and challenges. This is an important year in the U.S. as we look ahead to our presidential election, and so it's a timely topic for us to be discussing today. Tonight's program is being held in collaboration with International House at the University of Chicago, the University of Chicago Center here in Delhi, which is one of many centers that we have around the world, the Indo-American Friendship Association, led by Ambassador Surendra Kumar. He and I are longtime colleagues going back to his days in Chicago. And of course, the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. I am currently serving as the Director of International House at the University of Chicago, which is a residential and program center established by the Rockefeller family in 1932, which today is a part of a consortium of 20 international houses worldwide that span 4 continents and are united by one mission. Our mission is to provide students and scholars of different nationalities and diverse cultures with the opportunity to live and learn together in a community of mutual respect, understanding, and international friendship. We also serve as a program center for the various cities in which we are located. Our mission is achieved by daily interaction among our students and scholars through our internationally focused public programs, such as this evening's event, through our unique facilities, and through our community life activities designed to foster diversity of thought and experience. Today, the 20 members of the International Houses worldwide accommodate some 9,500 students annually from more than 125 countries. There are nearly 350,000 individuals worldwide who are able to claim alumni status at one or more of our organizational members, and many of them give back to our movement through their annual financial and other voluntary contributions. This results in more than 800 scholarships awarded annually by international houses worldwide, which serve to promote the academic, economic, and geographic diversity of our member institutions. In addition to our residential activities, International House sponsors educational and cultural programs such as music, dance, and theatrical performances, forums and debates on world issues, and cultural celebrations are just some of the hundreds of activities enjoyed by members of Chicago's communities and communities around the world. At International House of Chicago alone, we welcome over 40,000 visitors every year to attend our public programs. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. We invite you to attend future programs. This particular program has become an annual event. This is our fifth, I believe it's our 5th year. So we invite you back either next year for a program here in Delhi or on our campus at the University of Chicago in Chicago, Illinois, or at one of our sister houses around the world. And now I'd like to invite Ambassador Surinder Kumar to begin this evening's program. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Dr. Mishra. Let me begin explaining what this program is all about. We have a very simple objective. Through these kind of public discourses, to promote Indo-American Friendship Association, to promote friendship. And I must clarify, we are not part of MEA. This function is not being organized by the MEA. So whatever is said here is not the official reflection of the views of the government. So don't quote them that way. Second, I would like to advise all the panelists, we don't follow Chatham House rules. We pride not to follow Chatham House rules. Everything what you say, everything you do is being recorded because it's a live webcast. And you should be ready for controversy. You'll be quoted, misquoted, quoted out of context. And we don't mind little bit of controversy unless it goes totally out of control. Now, a lot has already been said. My half of the remarks have been taken care of by earlier speakers. In my personal view, India-US relations have never been better. You have to simply look back and say, what happened? President Clinton came here after 22 years gap. And now Prime Minister Modi and President Trump had met 4 times, 5 times last year alone. If you combine Prime Minister Modi's beginning as Prime Minister, he has met President Obama and President Trump maybe 15 times, different places, different, so you can see the kind of interactions going on, exchange of ideas through these summits and also through hotline, and we have 2+2 dialogue which we had just 2 weeks back, and you can see that we have a lot of convergence in spite of a lot of differences. So what we have to use that phrase, we don't allow our differences to become disputes. And in many issues, I don't want to preempt what our panelists are going to say, we have overcome the hesitation of history. Because so many things which we are not doing, after all, India has signed LEMOA, India signed COMCASA, now we are the major defense partner of the US, both sides have really moved a long distance since we started off, let's say 2000. Now, this photograph really symbolize a lot. You just look at that and you see how the Modi spirit reflects. Now, you will say it's simplistic, but certainly reflects the mood. If you watch television, how many billion people have really watched that program that evening? And you may have all the time. I think democracies have to have some differences. The beauty is that two sides can sit across the table, discuss all the differences frankly, candidly, without any kind of bitterness, and move on and find accommodation where possible. Famous Chinese amsman Deng Xiaoping used to say, if all the pluses are more than all the minuses, then the relationship is good. In this case, all the pluses are far, far weightier than the minuses, so we have to go forward. Now, I must also tell that I have already warned all the panelists that you have no keynote speaker here. Each one of you have only 10 minutes, and you will be alerted when you reach 8 minutes, and then the second buzzer comes at 10 minutes. After that, you have 10 seconds to wind up, make way for the next. That is not any disrespect to any one of you. It is just to ensure that we have half an hour for Q&A. Because Q&A is really most interesting when the people get a chance to quiz. Now, we couldn't have asked for much better, much more qualified, much more eminent and distinguished panelists. Half of them or most of them you see on television channel, they're hopping from one channel to another channel. Swasini is always there. General Mehta is always there. So is Professor Arun Kumar on different subjects. And I'm sure Arun is also leaving early just to go and join one of the panel discussions, which are prime time, super prime time. So this is a leaving behind the not prime time. Anyway, we have plenty of talent here. And if you like their views, please thank me. If you don't like them, grill them during Q&A and then meet outside the hall and grill again. I don't mind. But I don't own any responsibility. Each panelist owns his or her views. They are responsible for that. Nehru Memorial is not responsible for that. IAFA is not responsible for that. And we don't represent anybody other than ourselves. And you all are the people who will really note whether we are really doing something worthwhile or not. So I hope that you will have a very interesting, informative, stimulating, and entertaining, what should I say, intellectual roller coaster ride. So fasten your seatbelt. Thank you. So we begin with Mr. Arun Kumar Singh. Arun, a lot of water has flown through River Hudson since you left Washington. You have different president, you have different ambience, and a lot has happened that you have now more than, I think, 5 or 6 Indian origin Americans in the Congress and in the Senate. And at least at one time, 3 ladies were hoping to be president. Some of them, I think one of them has dropped out. So give an overview in 10 minutes, not enough, but I'm sure you are doing all these TV shows. Nowadays you are telezenic and telephonic or whatever you can call it. You can compress and give an overview. How do you see the relations as they stand today? And where are we going? Thank you.
All right, thank you. So first I want to thank University of Chicago, Ambassador Surendra Kumar, the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library for this opportunity. And Ambassador Surendra Kumar has given us all a very difficult task because he's told me that I have to cover overall And at the same time, I must not touch upon anything that the others are saying. And maybe I'll have to steal somebody's intellectual property. Okay. So much has been said in the last few years about India-US relations. A lot about the positive dimensions, as Ambassador Suren Kumar mentioned. The relationship has never been as good as it is now. So all that is a given. We take it as a starting point. I thought in my own comments today, I will focus on the challenges that are there, even as we build this relationship. And I think the first challenge that is developing, which we'll have to be careful about, is that since 2008, we have spoken of a bipartisan consensus in the US for a stronger India-US relationship. And to some extent, that bipartisan consensus is fraying a bit. Because there is still broad support in US Congress for advancing the India-US relationship. But there is growing criticism in the US Congress related to India and some of the policies right now. And that can challenge the effort of the administration to advance some proposals. Some months ago, there was a proposal to put India on par with NATO partners of the US, and that couldn't advance in US Congress. So if this consensus frays, then advancing the relationship further, especially where measures are required in US Congress, can be a bit of a challenge. And 22nd October, for example, there was a hearing in US Congress where India had come in for some criticism. In fact, an Indian American has now introduced a resolution in US Congress with 29 co-sponsors, which again, 36 now, which again challenges some of the policies of the Indian government. So we have to watch that. So that's one dimension. The second aspect where we have a problem is on the trade and economic relationship. And this surfaces from time to time. It's not something which is only at this stage. It was there in 2012-13 when there was some negative sentiment in US Congress related to what they saw as our measures on intellectual property rights, the measures on localization of productions in some area, especially in the telecom sector, some measures related to price caps. We see a recurrence of that happening with some intensity. The GSP benefits to India remain withdrawn. Tariffs on aluminum, steel products from India still remain in place. Although the rhetoric related to trade has come down a bit, and the signal from both sides is that they are seriously engaged in discussion to work out an agreement. And on some sets of issues, an agreement is likely, but many other differences will remain, be it on data localization, on the issue of price caps, and in the telecom sector and other areas. So that has to be watched carefully, that if there is no broad direction indicated about where the economic arrangements between the two countries are headed, problems will keep surfacing. Of course, the answer from India is that we are now buying more oil and gas from the US, something we hadn't done earlier. We've imported almost $8 billion worth in this sector. So that is something new. We'll be buying more and more in the civil aviation sector. And therefore, the US should not focus on the immediate trade deficit that they have with India, but with the expanding trade relationship. And trade has been expanding significantly, and it has reached a level of $140 billion. But we should be mindful of this, because individual US companies using individual congressmen and senators are in a position to raise questions, to raise create certain negative sentiment related to India. That has to be challenged. The third thing I'd mentioned is related to the Indian origin diaspora. Again, a very, very important factor of support for India. Now about 4 million strong, and the various events that have been done, be in New York, San Jose, or in Houston, signal the growing strength and presence of this community. More than 110,000 Indian origin doctors. 1 out of 7 patients in the US is seen by an Indian origin doctor. 40% of all hotel rooms provided by Indian origin persons, generating $13 billion worth of revenue. Today we have 4 Indian Americans in Congress, large number in the administration. So a growing strength and presence of this community which can contribute positively to understanding of India for stronger India-US partnership, but it can also have negative consequences, and we have to watch out for that. After all, this a fresh resolution in US Congress critical of India has been piloted by an Indian American person who is not critical of India per se, not critical of India-US relationship, but has her own politics related to her position within the Democratic Party, her being part of the Progressive Caucus, her hailing from Seattle. So we have to be mindful of that. And from time to time there have been sections in the Indian origin community who have, and not just now, earlier also, felt alienated from certain policies of the government of India and have done advocacy against India in the US Congress. And so again, that's something we have to. Then, for example, the China factor. In some recent conversations, the clear signal that I get is that despite the fact that there may be a phase 1 agreement between US and China on trade, on China, the US is essentially reversing the policies it had followed since 1979. Since that time, the US policy had been to work for integration of China in the international mainstream on the argument that a more integrated China would be a more liberalized China politically. It will live essentially under international rules and norms that had been piloted by the West. So that is changing. And of course, the interesting thing is that of late, US leaders have spoken, and senior people in the administration, that they see a strong India to be in US interest. But in 1979, when Vice President Mondale had gone to China, he had said that he sees a strong China to be in US interest. In 1984, in one of the national security decision directives that President Reagan had issued, he said that we must give technology and access for China to US technology because, again, a stable, prosperous, strong China is in US interest. So that was the US policy then. Now it has changed significantly. I think the US basic absorption is that they are in a generational struggle with China for technological domination, and therefore, even though there will be cooperation in different ways, there is a pushback on China's technological strength. And so how that plays out for India is something that we'll have to watch. On Pakistan and Afghanistan, at one level, the US policy, President Trump's policy has been far stronger. They have removed assistance, they removed military supplies, but they have resumed military education and training. And when President Trump was sitting next to Prime Minister Imran Khan in September, and he was asked by a journalist as to what do you see about Pakistan's involvement with terrorism against India, and he said, I'm focused on Iran at the moment. So clearly the US policy will be directed at any point of time by their perception of their own interest. And so we have to understand that sometimes there will be convergence, sometimes there may not be immediate convergence as we take this process forward. And so similarly, there will be challenges related to US policy on Iran, US policy on Russia. But having said all this, let me just say that the positive factors remain, and we should not overlook those. If you just saw the recent 2+2 dialogue between the two countries in December, there were a lot of positive outcomes. One of them, for example, that the Indian Navy would now engage with all the 3 US regional commands. Not just Indo-PACOM, but CENTCOM, AFRICOM, something that had not happened earlier. Again, a signal that the US sees India as an important strategic partner. On defense trade and technology, there have 3 new agreements, including cooperation between private sector industry. An industrial security annex has been signed, which will enable the private sector in India to become part of the US global supply chain for defense production. And they've identified cooperation, new areas of cyber, space, and NASA and ISRO will work on a joint synthetic aperture radar satellite by 2022. So there is a lot of positive momentum in the relationship, but we should be mindful of the challenges and work to overcome them to keep advancing the relationship further. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun. You have escaped the second buzzer. Well, before I ask DCM Kagan, give him a big hand. The first time he appearing in our function. Edgar, do you agree with Ambassador Arun Singh? He has given a long list of challenges. Are these challenges or they are figment of his imagination? And you can concentrate on these are prospects. It's not prospect and challenge. 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Kumar and Denise and Mr. Mishra. It's great to be here. I want to thank the audience for coming, and obviously my fellow panelists. Let me start off by saying that, in one way I'm very happy that the detail that Avastar Singh has given takes away the need for me to address many of these things. What I will say is that I think first and foremost, as Ambassador Singh said, and as Ambassador Kumar said, what is remarkable about the U.S.-India relationship today is how far it has come. And, inevitably, the nature of this sort of discussion, the nature of the kind of work that many of us do is to look at problems. But I think that if you take a step back and you look at the arc of the last 70 plus years, what is really remarkable is where we are today, and even over the last 20 years, which really, in many ways is a sort of new chapter and a fairly consistent chapter in which both countries have made very significant investments in improving the relationship. What's really remarkable is how much progress we've made in the last 20 years. I think it's quite significant that we have had 4 American presidents and 3 Indian prime ministers from 2 different parties on each side who have all spent considerable political capital and made significant investment in the idea of improving the relationship. And I think that while that doesn't mean that we can rest on our laurels, that doesn't mean we can take for granted that there will be continued broad bipartisan support. Obviously, we'll have to keep working at it. But I think that it is quite remarkable. And, just on the trade side alone, inevitably, there are going to be frictions and points of disagreement. That's been true from the very beginning of the relationship. It's been a very consistent theme. But if you look back in 2001, the total trade between the 2 countries was $20 billion. Last year, it was $142 billion, and the increase from 2017 to 2018 was around $17 billion. So, that's a sign of a really quantitative and qualitative change in the relationship. I think that when you look at where the relationship is going, I think, yes, there are going to be points of friction. I have worked on U.S. relations with some of our closest partners and some of our competitors. I've worked on U.S. relations with Australia, with Israel, with Korea, with Japan. And, I will tell you that from a diplomat's perspective, having a close relationship doesn't mean that you agree on everything. Quite the opposite. I mean, we all know that we have very different discussions with our family members and with our closest friends than we do with people that we know less well. And I think that when it comes to the relationship between our countries, the closer we get, the wider range of things we do together. And I think what's really remarkable when you look at the U.S.-India relationship today is that in many ways it benefits from the poor beginning, in the sense that the government-to-government relationship really has underperformed for most of the history of the relationship. If you look at the memoirs, you look at the histories, the government officials, the leaders on both sides have been frustrated at many points with the relationship. What has driven where we are today are the people-to-people ties. And because of the breadth and depth of the people-to-people ties, we actually have a very strong, very stable relationship that reflects the aspirations of people in both countries. It also is very broad. I mean, the range of things that we do together goes well beyond the things that we sort of normally talk about in terms of trade, investment, security cooperation. And I don't want to take anything away from those things. Those things are very important. But when you look at the research we do together, when you look at the cooperation on space, when you look at the cooperation in combating terrorism, in dealing with international organized crime, if you look at the range of things that we do in terms of trying to combat disease together, like multi-drug resistant diseases, I mean, it really is remarkable how much we do together. And I think that is the key thing, is as we do more together, we will find things to disagree on. Inevitably, we're not going to always agree, and this is true in all of our other relationships, and I suspect in India's as well. We're not going to agree on how to do everything. We're not going to agree, we're going to look at things from different perspectives, as reflects the fact that we are very different countries in many ways. But I think that ability to talk frankly, to figure out what the points of contention are, to then look for ways to solve them, is something that we are much, much better at today because we have the experience. So I think that when you look at the broad axes of the relationship, I think that we have a tremendously strong foundation in the very broad and strong people-to-people ties. I mean, I will say that as an American, I'm constantly surprised and impressed at the fact that everywhere I go in India, and this includes this from my time as Consul General in Mumbai, I could go to small, isolated villages in Maharashtra, and people would come and tell me about their relatives and friends who were in the United States. The sense of connection to the U.S., I think I have been very surprised by and very impressed by. And I think that gives us an incredibly strong foundation. Now, in terms of things that we want to do together, obviously, we want to find ways to address some of the differences on trade, and I think we're working very closely right now to try and do that. And, this is a reflection of the fact that both countries have an interest in trying to find ways to support the growth and the economy for both of our countries and our peoples. I think on security, we are doing a lot more together. I think, as Ambassador Singh said, the 2+2 was successful, but it was also successful as an iterative process. The fact that the more we do together, the more we have to do together, and the more opportunities we have to look for ways to cooperate more effectively. And I think that the 2+2 by itself is significant, but I think that when you put it in the context of the broader range of discussions that we have in the evolution of the relationship, I think that it shows that we are really moving from a sort of aspirational, theoretical discussion to getting into nuts and bolts of how we work more effectively together. I think that when you look at things having to do with cooperation against terrorism, when you look at things about having to do with trying to expand opportunities for study in our respective countries, I think that we really are finding ways to make real progress. And so for me, what I see is that from an American perspective, and Ambassador Singh said this, I would put a different spin on it, which is that the U.S. does see that it is in our interest to have a strong, stable, successful, prosperous India take its rightful place in the world. Obviously, that is not that doesn't mean that we will agree on every single thing, and inevitably there will be disagreements on issues that are important to both countries. But India's success is very much in the U.S. interest. And I think that what we are looking for is a continued opportunity to build out and broaden the relationship that we have so that we can find more ways to work together to benefit people in both countries.
Great. You didn't hear any buzzer. Now we move from the overview to specific areas. I turn to Professor Arun Kumar. This economy drive the foreign policy. You know what is going on between China and USA? The economic issues which are really driving. A few months back, we had problems about tariffs. US imposed some tariffs on us. We had some items in there. Early last year, President Trump was talking about Harley-Davidson motorbike, which only, I think, 100 of them were exported, not more. But please give us, where do we stand? We know the trade is going up, as DCM said, from where we started, where we are today, is a sea change. But still we have 17, 18, I think, trade dispute pending in WTO.
Okay, I must begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me, and especially Ambassador Surendra for pursuing me systematically to come here. So, relations, as has already been spelled out, between the two nations are strategic in nature, and the economic relations have to fit in within that parameter. They cannot be outside that. But within that, as has already been said, there are immediate issues and there are long-term issues. So we have to focus on both, see how to address that. And as Ambassador Zorin said, the major challenge for both of us is China. There's a trade deficit that both of us have, a very big trade deficit that we have vis-a-vis China. And there are other concerns about technology as well. So we have to address that. And that's where I'd argue that given the differences that exist between India and China, there has to be a very nuanced long-term relationship established between the two nations. Today we are talking in the context of a globalizing world, which implies greater flow of goods, services, capital, labor, and technology. And I think these are the factors on which we can collaborate and which we can do something that would work to both our interests. What we need to appreciate is that the two nations are at very different levels of development. US is one of the most advanced nations, while India is still a very poor developing nation. So what is it that can work? I think the US, if it wants a long-term relationship, I think had to ignore many of the short-term issues and come on to the longer-term perspective. That is very important. And in this, I think if we look at the macro variables, our GDP size are very different, per capita incomes are very different, GDP composition is very different. We still have the largest number of people in agriculture, whereas in the US, it's a minor, percentage, less than 1% in agriculture. Services is very dominant in the US. It's not so dominant, but it is still, very large in India. US controls global financial resources and flows. India has very little draft on those global financial flows. Today, in the last 3 years, Indian economy's rate of growth has become zero or negative. The US is still growing, and that's the difference that we have to work at. But the US has one big advantage which India doesn't have, and that is the dollarization of the world economy. A dollar is acceptable everywhere. The rupee is not, and therefore the US doesn't have to worry as much about balance of payment difficulties as India has. And I think this is something very crucial that we have to focus on in our relationship. If you look at these macro variables and then come to the micro variables, unemployment in India is a record high, but the US has a record low unemployment at this point of time. Education, health, physical infrastructure are at vastly different levels in the two countries. For instance, in India, the Acer reports show that 50% children in rural schools in 5th grade cannot read or write or do maths of the 2nd grade. So we have a lot of problems about skills. So how do we get these skill differences to sort of balance out in the Indian context? So there are many constraints that India has. There are internal difficulties. We have a very weak R&D capability. Technology, which is very important for global competitiveness, that is quite weak, and that is shown up in the fact that India didn't sign RCEP. China was pushing us, but we did not sign, and that's because we have weakness in technology. So how do we move towards a higher technology perspective? And this is where I think it's important to recognize that WTO divided up technology between high technology, intermediate technology, and low technology. We are stuck at the intermediate and low technology level, and there's a lot of crowding in, and so terms of trade have been moving against us globally. And that's important, when we look at how well we are doing internationally. Governance issues are very important in the Indian context. We have large amount of illegality as measured by the size of the black economy, which is roughly 62% of GDP. There's a lot of crony capitalism, which results in weakness in competition. It also results in failure of policies, whether it be in education and health or at the macro level. These need to be addressed within the country if we are to pose a relationship of some kind of equity vis-a-vis the US. Recent steps like demonetization GST have led to a deep crisis. The attempt to formalize the informal economy is also resulting in a crisis because the informal sector is 94% of the workforce and 45% of the output. And that cannot be formalized. So the attempt to formalize is only marginalizing the informal sector, which is resulting in a problem. Now it's said that formalizing the informal sector will get more taxes, but that's not the case because most of the informal sector incomes are way below the taxable limit. So they're not black incomes. Bulk of the black incomes are generated in the formal sector. So, but what's happening is, as a result of the marginalization of the, informal sector, the social fabric is being torn apart. And this is something of concern because when social fabric gets disturbed politically and economically, then investment gets affected. So investment rate in the Indian economy has been going down. Now, in that situation, expecting foreign investment to come in a big way is a challenge that we'll have to worry about. So the issues that face the Indo-US relationship, one of the issues I think is the conflict in West Asia, where India is getting drawn in, and it was referred to in vis-a-vis Iran. But also the oil-producing countries are in turmoil, and that's not good for us. And I'm sure the other experts will speak about that. But in the context of the Make in India program, we've raised tariffs in the last two budgets. That, I think, is something that the US has been worried about. Other nations are also worried about that. In sectoral aspects, pharmaceutical companies are facing non-tariff barriers in the USA. IT sector is again facing challenges, and there's a problem vis-a-vis the H-1B visa. E-commerce, data protection and storage, that's again a challenge between India and the US. It's not just a challenge about security and access to data by the state, but also privacy concerns and data for commercial purposes, creation of monopolies and predatory pricing that could come about. Environmental degradation is something that affects India very adversely because of the large number of poor people, and the US leaving Paris Convention and diluting environmental rules within the US is a challenge for India. So what kind of cooperation can we have? I think the first and foremost is that there are 90 tax havens, and large amount of capital moves through these tax havens. And we are worried about the BEPS, the base erosion profit shifting, which lowers the tax collection both in India and the US. There's growing illegality at the international level and flight of capital, which reduces the availability of capital within India for its own development. India needs technology to upgrade itself, and that requires greater cooperation. Capital flows, along with the high technology to upgrade various sectors like energy, etc., would also help us in the balance of payment. We need technology to increase agricultural productivity because still 45% of the workforce is in agriculture. And what we also need is that the technology should not be labor displacing, because where would the labor, 45% of the workforce, where would it go if you have labor displacing technologies? That will only create problems for urbanization and other things. We also need clean technologies like solar power and cheap clean water production. That also we require. So in conclusion, given the common challenge of China, and the very different stages of development of the two countries, the diversity of India and the poor governance here, the US has to promote complementarities and help with these challenges. And this is where I would say that the long term is what needs to be focused at, not the short term. And in the long term, if India does well, I think that will benefit US, even if in the short run, some of the things that's happening in India may not be things that are, welcomed by the US. So I think the long-term focus is very important. The short term, I think we have to ignore many of the things that may be a problem between the two nations. Thank you for your patience.
Sir, before I move to General Mehta, India-US Business Council meeting have been talking for last few years. We should have bilateral trade touching $500 billion. You are talking long term. Do you think we can reach 500 billion in 2-3 years' time?
I don't think 2-3 years, is possible to achieve $500 billion going from $140 billion. Unfortunately, we don't have a roadmap, for many of these things, whether it be $5 trillion economy or doubling of farm incomes or the $500 billion. We need to work solidly and work out a way in which we can achieve some of these goals. That is where I think we have been lacking. We announced many things, but we don't have a roadmap for it.
Thank you. So, General Mehta, when we talk about India-US trade, defense is one area in which US can't complain. Last 10 years, we have now $18 billion defense products which we have imported. I think we have become largest importer of the US defense. And some of these agreements which we refer to, LEMOA, COMCASA, we have become major defense partner. This is all good science. But tell me, in terms of, because our Air Force, Army, Navy all have long inventories, how far we are getting what we want, and how far we are like to advance in terms of joint research, joint production, all that. In security, cooperation in terrorism and cyber and other things.
Sorry folks, no time for jokes. But this is the creme de la creme of the presentation. I will address the questions you've raised as I go along. I have always felt that the India-US defense relations are the linchpin of the bilateral relations. Although ideological and Cold War tensions kept India and US apart, defense relations was the solitary ray of hope, keeping bilateral relations afloat, but conspicuously bereft of any political underpinnings till the India-US nuclear deal. I am a beneficiary of the US International Military Education Training Program as a graduate of Fort Leavenworth of the bicentennial in 1975 at Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. Talking about defense sales, that till 2008, we had no defense purchases or acquisitions from the US. I recall in my army time that we were looking for about 8 or 10 gun locating radars, and we asked the United States in the mid-1985 that could we get this system, and it took us 10 years. It took us all of 10 years to get 8 systems that cost something like $85 million. And from 2008 onwards, that number increased to something like $15 billion. So that was a huge jump. A point that needs to be made in this defense relations is that compared to the BJP-led governments, the Congress governments were less forthcoming in establishing defense and security relations. There were 2 main drivers of the spurt in defense relations. The first were the kick-lighter proposals, and the second, paradoxically, were the nuclear tests of 1998, which led to the Stroop-Talbot and Jaswant Singh talks, culminating in the next steps for strategic partnership leading to the nuclear deal of 2008. What were the kick-lighter proposals? In 1991, Lieutenant General Claude Kick-Lighter, he was from PECOM, came up with a set of proposals which were service-to-service exchanges, defense cooperation framework, steering groups, and so on. The first military exercise was held in February 1992, and the first agreed minute on defense cooperation was signed in 1995. The defense cooperation agreement was signed for a 10-year agreement in 2005 and renewed again in 2015. Many other agreements followed, and finally in 2018 we had this defining 2+2 format that was set up that Arun spoke about. Now the maximum number of land, sea and air exercises that India has held with any country is with the United States. And the first trilateral exercise was held recently called Tiger Triumph. So you can see that sky was the limit. But this was backed up by the Defense Trade and Technology Initiative. Now this was quite defining because several agreements were signed on this, and the most recent are on co-developing and co-producing critical technologies, overriding some of the US export control laws, and agreements have been signed most recently on 7 new technologies. For this, India-specific rapid reaction cells were established. India was declared a most favored non-NATO ally and also called a special defense partner. But there were hiccups, which I will come to later. The mechanism signed, that is the Industrial Security Annex on defense trade, will enable smooth transfer of classified technology and information between defense entities of US and India, that is private defense entities of India. Defense trade, which we just mentioned, which was 0 till, or 80 million till 2008, went up to something like 15 to 18 billion in 2018. And at least $12 billion worth of equipment sales, acquisitions are in the pipeline. Now I'll move on to the defense and security relations, which are based on those 4 tongue-twisting foundational agreements that he could pronounce and I can't. So I won't talk about these, but they deal basically with logistics, secure communications, sharing intelligence, and of sharing intelligence on geospatial, that is navigation and targeting in the space. 3 of the 4 agreements have been signed. Note, the first agreement on logistics was signed in 2002. The next agreement was signed in 2016. The third agreement was signed in 2018 at the first 2+2, and the fourth agreement, BECA, which deals with geospatial exchange, has not been signed and was expected to be signed. Now there are 2 hurdles. I talked about the hiccup. There are 2 hurdles in the defense relations. The first has to do something with India's own defense and security policy. And the problem is that India has a policy which does not believe in any military alliance, strategic autonomy, which has now changed to issue-based multi-alignment, and use of force. Now this inhibits the kind of initiatives that the Americans want us to take. The second factor is, of course, the Russia factor. Even today, 70 to 75% of our defense equipment with the 3 services is of Soviet, Warsaw or Russian origin. And Russia has been declared as India's exclusive strategic defense partner. And S-400, 5 systems for $5 billion are forthcoming despite the CATSA, the waiver. The waiver has not officially come. So on the strategic partnership, which was ushered in 2004, the main thing to remember now is that previously India was confined to PACOM, relations between Pacific Command and India Command. Now those have been extended to Central Command as well as Africa Command. And we're going to have exchange of officers from the Navy, at least to start with CENTCOM. Now on India Pacific, Admiral Harry Harris, who's attended Raisina Dialogue 2016, 2017, 2018, he made these proposals. The first proposal he made was to India on joint patrolling. And he said, why can't India and US be more ambitious? Let us do joint patrolling in the Indian Ocean, South China Sea, in the Pacific, or anywhere our leaders want us to do joint patrolling. India was very silent on that. And in fact, the Indian naval chief had to turn around and say, we do not do joint patrolling. We only do joint patrolling with our maritime neighbors. And so Admiral Harry Harris, who moved on to South Korea, was disappointed in what happened. Let me end with a footnote. And that footnote is a chota peg of strategic distrust. I am of the 1971 war generation, and some of us remember how USS Enterprise came into the Indian Ocean. And US Enterprise revisited India, Cochin, in 2003 on a goodwill visit. But in 2004, we had this nasty experience, the Indian Navy, with seeking helicopters which had American parts. When we signed a deal on the Hawk trainer aircraft with the Brits, in that there was a special clause. There will be no US parts in the Hawk trainer aircraft. And in 2005, and I know I've exceeded my time, but I am the oldest on this panel. So in 2005, when the India-US Defense Framework Agreement was signed, some intrusive paragraphs were introduced in that Defense Framework Agreement which were detected by our then Defense Minister, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee. So with the US, I think the principle is, normally the principle is trust and verify. Some people say that it is still verify and trust. And I know people in India ask that can India really trust the US? And people in US ask, can we trust India? I'll stop here.
This thing of trust or distrust, Mr. Ramesh Jairam told some time back, few years back, at the time 60, 70, Uncle Sam, go home, Uncle Sam, go back. And he said, whisper quickly and take me with you. Now we move to Dr. Zora or Daulat Singh. You have very flexible team, convergence, strategic convergence, we have strategic partnership with so many countries. But how our priorities, American priorities, strategic priority really converge, whether it's the Indo-Pacific, whether it's China, whether Afghanistan, whether Gulf, you can throw light, how much is convergence, how much is the difference?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and welcome to my colleagues. So for me, I prefer to sort of describe the relationship where you have these convergences and divergences operating at the same time. So maybe those binaries possibly are not a suitable way to... What complicates this relationship, or at least gives it this intense history, is that the one state that poses this existential, ideological, military threat to India is also still, till this day, a formal treaty ally of the United States. So that's a reality that we continue to live with. It also is complicated that you are dealing with a superpower, the United States, and a proud regional power. That itself creates, regardless of the motivations and our inclinations of the political leaderships or elites of both sides, that geographical reality will make it sort of a more challenging feature. My sort of central theme today, which I'll probably give the conclusion up front, is that the changing power transition that we are already witnessing in the international system and in Asia is going to actually make navigating the US-India relationship far more challenging and complicated in the coming decades. So this is really an argument for a more realistic setting and an assessment of what we should be doing, defining our interests more sensibly, because I feel that this high-flown rhetoric that sort of came in the mid-2000s, came in a very different context of an international environment where you had sort of unipolarity. You didn't have many of the dilemmas that we are seeing today. So I feel a more realistic discourse is the first step, because it does a disservice to the actual convergences that India and US continue to possess today. So we might ask, what are these convergences? And it's not just about China in sort of my understanding and history. Even though China has been at the heart of the Indo-US relationship, or at least not just in the last 10 years, but from 1949, 1950. But what are these other factors? So I try to list them out sort of empirically, just asking this question, that what is it that India does for the United States? What are the benefits or advantages that come with a cooperative India for the US? So for me, the number one factor for the United States as an advantage is it strengthens US influence in South Asia, in the Indian Ocean region. It provides ideological support for the US in Asia. That is a positive relationship with India. It offers a growing market for the US private sector, including defense manufacturing, which we've seen. It allows the US to engage in a far more sophisticated logistical interaction between its various regional commands. Many of them are in the northern Indian Ocean. It also provides leverage against China in the future. That is a close Indo-US relationship. But I think the number one sort of success for US foreign policy in the last 20 years has been that they have got India, or India has has attained a certain posture in Asia and in the region where even when we disagree, there's a sense of a positive abstention in favor of the US when it comes to other major powers in this neighborhood. I think that, so even when you say India is non-aligned, I think that non-alignment is quite clear to all of us that it's leaning in favor of the United States. So I think that's a huge success for US foreign policy. What does India get with a cooperative United States? What does it get from a very, very realpolitik perspective? I think the number one positive that India gets is it accesses this international order. The international order that we live in today, its institutions are still, despite the power transition, dominated by the US and its allies. So you can't access or the benefits of those institutions without having a stable relationship with the United States. I think there's been this impression that we can craft a relationship with Europe or Japan or Australia. It doesn't work because those states, in my understanding, are really dependent client states when it comes to the global system. They will follow the lead of the United States. So I think Indian policymakers have recognized that. The nuclear deal phase really was about this, that we are integrating into this US-led order. Of course, we'll come to the complications that we've seen now in the power transition, that order itself is receding and it simply cannot provide the public goods that we thought we'd benefit from. So I'll come to that a little later. So what else does India benefit from the United States? I think it provides options for India's economic development and modernization. I think that's been listed. That the fact that we can't leverage or tap some of the options that are available from the United States is a failure on our part, a failure of our political economy, of our policymakers, and of the lack of a roadmap. But the options exist. Why can't we do what China did with the United States? After all, 40 years of the reforming and opening up of China, the success of the Chinese economic experience has come because it tapped the US-led system. We have not been able to do that, but that's not an argument for not having a positive relationship with the United States. That's an argument of our own internal grand strategic, institutional and other aspects that we simply can't go, maybe it's a weak state. There's several reasons. What else does it do for us? A strong relationship with the United States. It does provide leverage on China and Pakistan to the extent of which, of course, can be a matter of a serious debate, and it should be. But there is definitely some leverage that we do get. We don't want to overplay it, but it does. It also provides a certain space for India. I think having a positive relationship with the United States allows India to rise over the next several decades without inviting a counter or negative policy. We've seen the Cold War period had, for all practical purposes, from the late 60s right up to the 1980s, a policy of containment. I think that's what it was. And why was the United States able to do that? Because it had a treaty ally who had been built up militarily with US technology and arms, and the only purpose for those arms was to fight against the Indian state and Indian military. And that state still exists today. So US has a certain potential negative leverage. So to counteract that, you need that positive tie or equation with the United States. I think the other big advantage that India benefits from the US, we may not choose to like it, is the third party role that the United States plays in many regional crises with Pakistan. It actually goes back even to 1950. In fact, one of the subjects of my book was a crisis that India has with Pakistan in 1950. And one of the central reasons for the resolution of that crisis was US pressure put on the Pakistani leadership at the time to reach some sort of an understanding with India. And they were being extremely sort of stubborn in reaching out to India. So, of course, we know in more recent decades it's been the Kargil crisis. You've had a very important role played by the United States in stabilizing. Even the last 1 year, this post-Pulwama, Balakot, the Pakistani response, I don't think the government of India would have escaped unscathed had it not been for the behind-the-scenes role played by the US and its allies. So I think these benefits are understood. So now to make the leap, and I'm just going to take 2 or 3 minutes if you allow me, because I'm going to try and list out some of the big themes that are actually sources of convergence for India and the United States, but the way the agenda setting happens, the discourse, it's usually the United States that is shaping the conversation on these issues. I'll just list them very briefly. So let's look at China, for example. So when we talk of China in think tanks, international commentary, what are the issue that really comes up? It's always about maritime China. It's about the South China Sea, about the Western Pacific, about areas that truly matter for the United States and the Navy and its allies. But are these significant areas for Indian security? I don't think so. The Indian security challenge vis-a-vis China is a continental one. And some of us have written about this, where right from the Cold War period, I think the United States has made it quite clear that it simply cannot provide the level of strategic support the way, let's say, the Soviets could for India during the Cold War. It simply is, it's a maritime power, and you will not be able to have those reciprocal benefits. For example, can the United States come in to a crisis where China and Pakistan are engaging in some sort of continental coordination in an actual military crisis? I don't think so. So the argument that China is this big glue for India and the United States needs to be tempered with the reality that the geographic setting, the geopolitical setting, and the vital interest that India has are not the same as defined by the United States. Let's look at CPEC, for example. When we look at India's position on the BRI in South Asia, I haven't seen too much of a US response on China-Pakistan economic ties, for example, apart from maybe a recent tweet by the State Department desk a few weeks ago, a month ago. I haven't seen the US able to really say that, yes, we are going to push back on Chinese economic influence in the subcontinent. I think that's the source of not necessarily divergence, but that you're not able to arrive at a prioritization of which parts of Chinese power are we going to balance together. Let me just briefly, even on Pakistan. Okay. So let me just close by a question that I'm posing for all of us today, that does this power transition to multipolarity and our quest for having a multi-aligned foreign policy fit with the US approach, which is still not adapted to this changing world order? So I see ourselves in two boats. We want this world order, we want multipolarity, this open, plural security architecture, but most of our engagement in these institutional settings, these quads, these dialogues, are really built to create some sort of a direct structure or an alliance structure. I don't know if it's compatible with the way the world is heading. So either we need to read it, because the United States is quite clear what it wants from India. Are we clear on what we want from the world and where we are going to fit in the United States into a bigger world map? I don't think that conversation is even happening in India, and I think that's the biggest failure of Indian grand strategy today. Thank you.
Well, I now move to Suhasini Haidar. Her area has been pinched by quite a few other speakers, but there's still a lot left. I think you must have read, this is a book by Tanvi Madan of Brookings, India, called The Fateful Triangle. She says that China has been influencing US-India relations during the Cold War, but I think that is very much real or true even today. And then how far US policy towards Pakistan, Afghanistan, some other countries impinge. I mean, because they have covered your area, you can other areas. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ambassador Surendra Kumar, and thank you. This has become almost a tradition, I think, and as a result, we spend this evening in January every year crystal ball gazing for the rest of the year. Let me tell you how successful we were last year. And how it's very clear that this is not under Chatham House rules, and what we say over here does go far. Is last year there seemed to be a consensus that the real problem in the Indo-US relationship was the lack of engagement right at the top. Because in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, the two leaders had only had one real bilateral meeting. And two meetings on the side. Clearly the two leaders made up for that, and that photograph is a testament to that, so maybe they were listening in as well. So I'm supposed to speak about, I think, the elephants in the room as far as the relationship goes. And I think that the relationship, like a lot of relationships the United States has around the world, and some of the relationships India has around the world, does not lack for elephants on each issue, each single issue. So what I'm going to do, because we have this time limit, is just take you through what I think are the 5 major issues in the year, which will give you an idea of not just where the relationship is, but where these elephants stand and how much of how much of an influence they can actually have on the relationship. I think the first has been dealt with at some length, because we've dealt with it in strategic affairs, we've dealt with it in defense as well. But the question of where the Indo-Pacific policy is going to go this year, I think will decide very much what is happening in the relationship, but it also decides how much of a space the two are going to give China. One part of it is, of course, will the United States be pushing for much more? You spoke about what Admiral Harry Harris said. On joint patrols, it was pushed back. There have been other requests to do things in terms of U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo speaking about the idea that the Indo-Pacific policy was actually, or the Quad was a way of putting China in its place. I think there was a visible pushback to that in the silence that followed those comments. So the question there is how much is the U.S. Really going to want to go ahead with this policy? How much attention is the U.S. going to give this policy, which at one point seemed to be the center stage of its strategic policy abroad, and now after the events in Iran, people are wondering if West Asia will take that place of concern. The other side is, what is India going to make of that policy? Because while India is a part of the Quad, the Prime Minister has himself said that he does not see Indo-Pacific as more than a geographic concept. It is not a strategic concept. India has also done what many would say have baffled our Western partners. Things like inviting Russia into the Indo-Pacific policy. Things like ensuring that many other partners also join our Indo-Pacific policy, to the point where someone did ask, is China going to be our next partner in the Indo-Pacific policy? So I think where that relationship goes and how much of a place our relationship with China, takes up space over there is going to decide it. The second is going to be, what is the future of the US's South Asia policy? And in South Asia, I will just add Central Asia, because, the US does look at it as South and Central Asia. One part of it is, what is the US going to do in Afghanistan? The other part of it is, what is the US going to do in Iran? Both of them are going to have an impact on the Indo-US relationship. And the reasons should be fairly evident. One of them is, of course, that if the US continues on the path that we had heard of last year towards the elections, talking about a pullout of troops, this is going to have an impact on India. And it is going to have an impact on the Indian relationship with the US, because there's one more elephant in the room after these two countries, and that is Pakistan. How much is the US going to need Pakistan if, in fact, this hypothetical pullout is going to go ahead? So that's one part of it. The next is what happens with Iran. It is clear that with the US's policy on sanctions on Iran, whether it was indirectly or directly, India's relationship with Iran has suffered. It is a matter of time to see whether India will, the Indo-US relationship will suffer as a result of what India suffers. Because remember, the first part is on oil prices. The fact is, we can get oil from a lot of places. We might not get as cheap and as compatible with Indian refineries that sort of oil as we did from Iran. We have given that up. Is there something that will compensate? There is the US carve-out for Chabahar, but as we have seen in the last few years, the carve-out isn't much help, because the kind of sanctions the US has already put, and now the president has said we will put more on Iran, effectively means that it is very difficult to manage a port in Iran, and where Chabahar is. Bandar Abbas, I think, does already run most of the trade. To find more trade to go through Chabahar is going to be difficult. The other part of it is, of course, the trade through Chabahar, which is meant for Afghanistan again. If the US does continue with the idea of a pullout, maybe they won't need it as much. These are all hypotheticals, but in the next year we will get some of the answers about where they will go, and each of these countries are going to play a part in the Indo-US relationship. I think the third is definitely going to be the trade policy, and the trade policy is not just about what is the kind of trade deal that India and the US put together, because I think it's very clear from what officials have said is while they have not been able to forge that deal is around the corner. I think the kind of effort we have seen in the last year, in 2019, leading up to this point, shows that at some point they will have something to announce. I don't think they can get away without that. You may even see a very big ticket, high-level meet to announce that trade summit, given all the effort that has gone into this year. So I don't think there's a doubt that the trade policy will play a factor in the Indo-US relationship. The question is, at what cost? Which of the US's demands will be met? Which of the Indian demands will be met in order to forge that trade policy? Also looking at what are the global factors. Professor Arun Kumar mentioned, some of the global factors that are playing out on the Indo-US trade policy as well. There is a protectionist move around the world. I don't think India is alone. I don't think the US is alone with that. There is a move where the WTO is becoming a little more irrelevant. The US's moves on its arbitration mechanism is a part of that. There is the fact that many more regional FTAs are actually the way of the future. So the US has NAFTA, EU has EU, RCEP is now the entire east of India, Mercosur in South America, the Gulf has its own, the AU, the Eurasian Union. India has only the SAARC FTA in that sense. And that's not really going anywhere. So the question is really going to be, if everyone's going to get into regional architectures and are going to be protectionist, where is India going to go? Particularly when you look at the fact that one of the trends is also that very few people want services. Most people are talking about trade in goods. Most deals are being cut on trade in goods. This has been a factor in the Indo-US relationship, and I think it will be a fact of life. I'm not sure it is anyway affecting us anymore because India has stopped raising the issue of immigration and the issue of H-1Bs and all the rest of that. But we can see that it does have a fraying effect, particularly on the people-to-people ties. Regardless of whether the figures themselves show, a secular growth, what we're seeing is a general trend towards slowing down the numbers that will be able to benefit from that part of trade. And so then I will just leave you with the fourth and the fifth. The fourth being where US sanctions go. And by that, one part of it is on CAATSA, is on whether the legislature is going to go ahead and stop or try to stop the Indian purchase of the S-400 from Russia. India has already made, I think, 2 tranches of payment and possibly will, attract the idea of sanctions sometimes this year. The other part is the unexpected part of the sanctions, but the kind of interest the legislature has taken in the US on domestic issues in India, whether it has been Kashmir and 370, whether it has been the Citizenship Amendment Act, and whether there will be any kind of a demand for something on the lines of either what the US has, the Magnitsky Act, or otherwise. And finally, I think when we're looking at factors that will play a part in the relationship, it will be about how much the leaders meet this year. This is, of course, an election year in the US. So the election in the US becomes, in effect, an elephant in the room. And by that, I don't mean for a moment that I know who's going to win it, because, of course, the Republican Party logo is an elephant as well. But it does change how strongly Congress will go after India on certain issues. It will change very dramatically how much the government that comes to power has already got a relationship going with the current government in Delhi. And I think the final question will be, will we continue to talk about shared values when it comes to 2020 and 2021? Because, of course, we might be living in times where things like values take a backseat to things like transactions. But the question is, can people of both countries really build their relationship, as Ambassador Kagan had said, without those shared values in common.
Well, I think it is now the dragon which will influence more than the elephant. We have been talking so far about external dimension. Now let us move to domestic dimension. In 60s, there was a time when foreign policy was almost irrelevant for domestic elections. But now leaders hope to win elections by achievements in the foreign affairs. So we move to Professor Vijayachmi. She has spent decades in Indo-American affairs. Her recent research has been on the role of US in 21st century. And she has also done Indo-US. So please tell, Professor, how far domestic compulsions in USA and India are likely to affect Indo-US relations?
Thank you, Ambassador, and I also want to thank you for inviting me. The phrase that comes to mind is persistent persuasion, which probably most panelists agree as a description of you, but I also want to thank International House and the other fellow panelists, and for the great audience that I still see here, though I'm losing some of them already, even as I begin. But I want to start with the proposition. I know we've been traveling the world. In JNU, where I teach, we always often say that my school is called the School of International Studies. And there was a saying at the time when I was a student, there used to be join the Navy and see the world, join the Army, all of that. So we used to say join SIS and see the world. So I had a feeling that, the power transitions to Arun's globalized chains of et cetera, I have very many friends who were talking, and Suhasini and others. It was interesting to listen to, but I want to start with this proposition, which I think might interest you. I'm the last speaker, so I never know how much interest you have, but I have a compelling eye. I'm a teacher, so I do that quite often. But the proposition I have is foreign policy begins at home. So however much you travel the world, you still come back home. Or foreign policy is primarily generated from within. If you take this proposition and listen to what I have to say, I think we might find some of these elephants and some gaps, etc. This is my métier, so I think it's an interesting topic. Thank you for the topic. That said, now the question is, how much influence does the domestic have as a basis for foreign policy? That's really the question that I think he had in mind. And I also want to ask you, do you think it overshadows other elements? So if we say that domestic is important, then we need to assign a weight to how much it will overshadow. In other words, sometimes the motivation of a leader's decision or a leadership's decision, and there is a very good theory that can help you, polyheuristic theory, the number of multiple motivations that help a leader or a leadership to decide in foreign policy. That's a very interesting field. So, does it overshadow? And finally, is there a strong correlation between domestic and foreign? These are three very simple questions that come out of the proposition that I've outlined. And I think, let me start by explaining from India's side, okay? It's widely recognized now, at least, that domestic issues and foreign policy are powerfully joined. I read this very slim volume by Ambassador Richard Haas, who then became president of CFR. Foreign Policy Begins at Home was his book. I think it's a good reading. I mean, it really helps you understand how America does. But it has a validity of another kind. That this domestic, what he had said was compulsions. And if you look at the word compulsions, I think before the word compulsions, you need to look at the factors, domestic factors, that can actually help you understand why India and the United States are actually in a relationship together. And I think that validity comes from the fact that both are democracies who are integrated in global economic and political order, and therefore are alive not only to the geopolitical power transitions, but are also alive to their internal differences and changes. They're strongly alive to that. And I think that's a very valid reason for a focus of domestic compulsions in a setting of discussing Indo-US relations. There's also another point that needs to be made. Not only is this powerful correlation established because of its validity of examining two democracies, but also there's a growing link between domestic factors or thinking and countries' international role play or aspirational, whatever you want to call it. India's aspirations, many people have commented on the motivation for India to go nuclear. A large part of the literature will tell you it was also India's thinking that it needed to have this place in the world. It was a part of a prestige thinking. So these kind of thinking, you can't take it lightly anymore. You need to think about the domestic part of motivations in order to entertain or understand whether these relationships will sustain. It also does another very important thing, this focus on domestic compulsions. It explains failures. Unfortunately, we all skim over a number of failures. And I find that explanations not only must address what is happening, but they should also tell you why something failed. And I think this could help you. What are the factors and compulsions? And I would simply go very quickly now. One is strategic location or geography of India. I think that's very important. There was a little bit of talk on maritime and all of that. I believe that India is a seafaring nation. I looked up all the land frontier we have and the sea frontier, as sea lanes that we are using for getting our trade through. It's enormous. 70% is the last one, but 90 to 70%. So I think maritime, we need to keep an eye on that. I mean, it's just not our land mass and land frontier where we have 7 countries with whom we share borders, which are not demarcated. And so we have a source of policy tensions all the time. So total land borders is 15,200 kilometers. Coastline, 7,051 kilometers. So think about that. We are a maritime nation. So I think, you look at the government Sagarmala program. It's not come out because, we're just going on this ship and buying some oil and letting it come whenever it can. No. We have an interest there. Then the land frontiers. Now, our problem with China and Pakistan already alluded. But it has great significance for our defense policy. It has some domestic, intonation as well. Should we buy Chinese goods is now what's happening. It's more economic. But there's also this border area. Doklam was a very big issue inside India. It wasn't a, foreign policy, nobody bothered, Ambassador Kumar. People bother now. Doklam was a definitive point for everyone. So size, location. In other part of this domestic geographical factor is also about our natural resources. We at one time thought we had plenty of rivers. I've just designed a calendar which talks about Jal Shakti, which is the rivers of India. It's fabulous. I mean, you think about the rivers we have. But do we have it now? I mean, we have a real problem. So water will remain another very major source of our compulsion, in which we are willing to look for partnership as well as to stop hostile powers taking over. Because we have a huge population, and that's the next part, the resource, human resource. Our population has increased. We are 1.3 billion. A resource and at the same time a challenge. We need water, we need everything else. We also have a scientific area problem. We have succeeded in space, atomic energy, and aeronautics, ocean research, but electronics, technology, software. But we still have a problem. We need to provide electricity for everyone. So we are willing to look at some of the compulsions, and Indo-US relations has some of these. Now, I really don't have time, so I'm not looking at the economy, but I have a good deal to say about it. But there's a cultural and historical and philosophical outlook that also gives both India and the United States. Now, let me come to the US. Now, the US, demographics, voting constituencies, and the fact that, we also have religious and other kind of associational interest groups, I think one of the big factors that I see in the American domestic compulsions is that this geopolitics and geostrategics is not enough anymore. The American middle class, does US foreign policy actually help the American middle class? More and more research today is telling you that the majority of American middle class is not able to move upwards into upper middle class. To the lifestyle that their fathers had, they have to now become upper middle class to enjoy that. Their fathers were middle class. So, I have figures that can show you that. And the number has remained stable, like 59%, 51 to 59%, but that doesn't mean that their level of living has gone. And that anxiety has also correlated with the kind of make America great again, America first, all of that. So there is an impulse that is structural, that predates just any government. It cannot be, one cannot just say that Trump and Modi are the reason for anything moving this way or that way. There are a lot of domestic structural constraints and challenges that can predate the governments of the day. And those need to be tackled for you to sustain this very positive momentum. I'm not ruling out how important the external variables are. I think they're very, very important. That's what I teach most of the time. But I think also there's another very important thing that has changed American thinking in terms of domestic compulsions is also the factor of the I'm just trying to run through it, but the idea that, how domestic and foreign policy are now intersecting with each other. The visa curbs, both in terms of H-1B visas and the Muslim ban, both are symptomatic of what they feel inside. So I think there is a strong case to be made, Ambassador, for the topic that you thought of. I think in the beginning I was a bit skeptical when I began, but I have a lot more to say, which I'm used to a 2-hour class, so I crave your pardon in case I sounded a bit abrupt at some point. But the fact remains, I think there's a strong correlation between the domestic and the foreign. And I think the strength of relationships between countries, such as India and the United States, this has even more greater significance because they are democracies who face not just electoral challenges for each government, but also federalist challenges. They have states. They don't have just, one government to government. So I have to say that this was an interesting topic for me to look at, and I thank you for listening to me.
Okay. Let us give a big hand to the panel, please. Now we still have 25 minutes for question answer. We have taken a little more on the discussion. So those who want to ask question, raise your hand, identify yourself, be brief, not more than 40 seconds in your question. And questions are more preferred than the comments, because comments I'm sure you can make any time, but here you can quiz our eminent panelists. So who goes first? Everything is crystal clear. Who is the young lady? Ladies first. Give the mic to lady, please. Please, our mic.
Good evening, respected panelists. Thank you so much for this very enlightening discussion. My question is open to the panel. Briefly, there was reference to Indo.
Are you asking a specific person?
No, sir. My question is for the panel.